Thank you for joining me on The Things That Bother Me. Today's video is not about nostalgia. It's not about whether the 60s were good or bad. It's not about whether drugs are harmless. It's not about glorifying anything. It's about timing. It's about sequencing. It's about how one generation was allowed to experiment and the next generation was prosecuted. We're talking about a shift that doesn't get framed correctly. When they were 18 in many states, they could legally buy alcohol. When the next generation turned 18, the line moved. 21, not gradually, not organically, after they had already passed through. We're talking about the war on drugs, mandatory minimums, 3 strikes laws, zero tolerance policies, workplace drug testing, background checks that follow you for life. We're talking about how experimentation became incarceration, how a phase became a felony, how a warning became a permanent record. And we're going to look at the part nobody wants to say out loud. The system flexed until the people in power no longer needed it to. This episode is called From Free Love to Felony, and once you see the sequencing, you can't unsee it. Let's get into it. Episode 3, From Free Love to Felony. There was a generation that built its identity on rebellion. They didn't whisper it. They branded it. They said rules were cages. Authority was corruption. Tradition was oppression. They lit joints in daylight. They drank legally at 18. They drove home buzzed and called it being young. They filled parks and campuses and music festivals with smoke and sweat and noise and defiance. And the country didn't crush them. It watched, it filmed, it romanticized. They were finding themselves. That phrase did a lot of work, finding yourself, experimenting, pushing boundaries. That language didn't just describe behavior, it protected it. Because when you say someone is finding themselves, you're promising they still belong when they're done. And belonging is the difference between a warning and a record. When they crossed lines, the system flexed. That word matters. It flexed. It bent without breaking. It absorbed without branding. It forgave without remembering. They were fined, warned, lectured, sent home. Their mistakes expired. Their rebellion became nostalgia. Their recklessness became documentary footage. Their drug use became cultural mythology. The system didn't treat them like threats. It treated them like the future. And when you're treated like the future, your mistakes are temporary. That wasn't softness. That was insulation. Cultural memory versus legal reality. Go back and look at it. Woodstock, campus protests, beer at 18, marijuana smoked in daylight. In many states in the early 1970s, the drinking age was 18. You could buy alcohol at the same age you graduated high school, not illegally, not quietly, legally, and marijuana enforcement, inconsistent, selective, often dependent on geography, often dependent on who you were. Rebellion wasn't crushed, it was monetized. It sold albums. It sold fashion. It sold an identity that is now marketed back to us as authenticity. You'll grow out of it. That phrase was a shield. Because growing out of it assumes you get to grow. It assumes there's a future waiting for you. It assumes your mistake doesn't get stapled to your name. Then they took control. Time passed. They cut their hair. They bought homes. They entered institutions. They became judges, prosecutors, legislators, corporate executives, HR managers, board members, and something shifted. The tone hardened. Drugs weren't exploration anymore. They were decay. Crime wasn't a mistake anymore. It was moral collapse. The country didn't need understanding. It needed discipline, and discipline requires punishment, so the rules changed, but not while they were 18, after. After they had already crossed the bridge, after they had already aged out of vulnerability, after their records, or lack of them, were secure. That sequencing isn't accidental. The line moved. When they were 18, they drank legally in many states. When the next generation turned 18, the line moved. 21. A clean, bright, permanent line. Not 19, not 20. 21. They walked through the door. Then the door locked, and everyone behind them waited outside. If you want to call that coincidence, you can. But look at the timing. Look at who was already safe. The war on drugs wasn't about drugs. Then came the war on drugs. Not rhetoric, infrastructure, mandatory minimums, 3 strikes laws, sentencing guidelines that stripped judges of discretion. A judge could see your age, your clean prior record, your attempt at rehabilitation, and it didn't matter. The sentence was already written. That's not justice. That's automation. The prison population exploded through the 1980s and 1990s. Drug enforcement fueled it. same substances, same experimentation. Different consequences, because now the people experimenting weren't the ones writing the laws, and when the writers of the law are insulated from its consequences, the law gets colder. Enforcement left the courtroom. It didn't stop at prison. It moved into employment. Mandatory drug testing expanded. Not just pilots, not just heavy machinery, retail workers, warehouse workers, office staff, entry-level hires. Your off-duty life became reviewable. Your body became evidence. Even in states where marijuana later became legal, employers retained the right to test and terminate. Fail the test, no job, no job, no rent, no rent, no stability, and instability compounds. Meanwhile, retirement systems remained protected, assets appreciated, property values climbed, pensions were honored, security at the top, scrutiny at the bottom. The double standard, strip it down. When they smoked, it was rebellion. When you smoked, it was criminality. When they drove drunk, it was recklessness. When you drove drunk, it was enhanced sentencing. When they experimented, it was youth. When you experimented, it was a permanent checkbox that took life's opportunities away permanently. The moral standard didn't evolve. It narrowed, and narrowing always protects someone. The system didn't become stricter because society suddenly discovered danger. It became stricter after the people most likely to be affected had already passed through the vulnerable age window. That's not morality, that's insulation. In closing, Episode 1 showed you contrast. Episode 2 showed you timing. Episode 3 shows you insulation. When they were young, the system flexed. When you were young, the system hardened. That shift didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened after the generation writing the rules was no longer subject to them. If something is dangerous enough to permanently disqualify a 19-year-old today, it was dangerous enough then. If something deserved mercy then, it deserves mercy now. But mercy narrowed, punishment widened, and permanence replaced growth. A conviction doesn't fade. It follows you. Job applications, housing forms, loan documents, background checks. Have you ever been convicted? That question doesn't care if you were 19. It doesn't care if you changed. It doesn't care if the same behavior was culturally tolerated decades earlier. It just stays. What used to be a warning became a barrier. What used to be a phase became a file. What used to be forgiven became infrastructure. The ladder lost another rung. This one wasn't about tuition. It wasn't about housing. It wasn't about wages. It was about mercy. And when mercy becomes selective, power becomes comfortable. The door didn't just close. It locked. And the people holding the keys had already walked through. This wasn't about safety. It was about control. And control is easier when the next generation starts behind bars, or behind checkboxes, or behind closed doors. Next episode, we stop pretending this was moral panic. We talk about consolidation. Because punishment was the mechanism, consolidation was the goal, and consolidation is where power stops pretending. That's episode 4. Thank you for spending this time with me on the things that bother me. This wasn't about relitigating the past. It was about pattern recognition. When one generation experiments, it's culture. When another generation experiments, it's criminal. That shift didn't happen randomly. It happened after the people most affected were no longer vulnerable to it. That's not morality. That's insulation. If this episode made you uncomfortable, good. Discomfort usually means something just clicked. Next time, we move from punishment to power. Because once you normalize punishment, consolidation gets easier. And consolidation is where the real story starts. This is The Things That Bother Me. I'll see you in the next one.